Welcome back. Well, with us now, Mr. David Forbes. He's the General Secretary of the Postal Workers Union. We're talking with him in the context of the declaration made by the Minister of Finance as he read the budget speech a couple of Fridays ago. He said that he had instructed the CPO to begin meeting with the unions representing workers in the state sector for negotiations. Such negotiations have been delayed because on more than one occasion, the CPO's office was telling trade union leaders that they had no instructions to begin these discussions. So since then, what has happened? Mr. Forbes, good morning.
Pleasant good morning. And I want to say pleasant morning to Trinidad and Tobago. What you are indeed saying there is indeed correct with regards to outstanding wage negotiations for several periods, dating back from 2007 to current, and more so in the public sector, where we have stand-by for, that is at the level of the joint trade union movement. These periods would have dated from 2007, 2014 to 2016 as recent, 2017 to 2019, and 2020 to 2022. In that regard, what indeed has happened is that there was a stagnation in terms of economic stability for a number of workers in the public sector. And it is in that interest, we, in the labor movement, would have called on the government, led by Dr. Kit Rowley, even from his last administration, where there was no outstanding settlement of those particular periods and the impact it would have had on the workers in Trinidad and Tobago. As a result of that, we certainly would have been encouraged by the minister's statement in the budget recently. However, how that will be truly panned out in the coming fiscal period, as per the instructions to the CPO, would be interesting. We know that we are in an economic situation with regards to the pandemic and all of that, but even before the pandemic situation, these outstanding negotiations would have been before the present government. So it is in that regard, workers are certainly at a position where they are suffering in terms of stagnation of their ability to spend. We in the labor movement have put to the government many ways that they can settle these outstanding negotiations by way of liquidation, whether it be through housing, whether it be through bonds, whether it be through the whole question of shares, buying of shares, etc. There are many ways that the government can settle this long outstanding debt, and it is only fair that workers in this country share in the economics, in terms of the economic pie of such what we will call a wealthy nation. Trinidad is indeed a wealthy nation, and it is all about how we transgress the whole question of sharing from an equitable standpoint. So settling negotiation and the concept of stimulating economic growth, that is one of the ways that the government can look at. We always say that wage-led growth is one of the ways, and of course profit-led growth is the normal way that any government will operate. But inside of that, the whole question of stakeholders' involvement and getting just due is utmost paramount in that regard.
Go ahead. Finish the point.
You can ask the question. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
I was asking whether you have any sense of the number of workers we're talking here across the range of occupations, and therefore the range of the combination of
Yes.
unions representing workers in the state sector.
Right.
What is the body of workers we're talking there?
From the joint trade union movement level, we have about 7 unions treating with workers in the public utilities, in the state corporations, let it be Port of Spain Corporation, the Martin Regional Corporation, San Fernando Corporation, and of course in the utilities you have T&Tech, OWTU, you have where we are the Postal Services, another utility there, and of course in the essential services, in the general services also, you have the police, the fire, prison officers, So there's a whole general wide scope of employees who are working for the government who have been so affected by these outstanding periods.
And that includes, say RHAs and sort of state agencies
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, so you have the nurses who represent the workers in the health sector. And also in from the Public Services Association level, we have a lot of administrative areas in the public sector. For instance, the National Insurance Company boards. We have the Board of Inland Revenue and a number of agencies within the public sector where you have a diverse number of workers who is currently working on wages since 2014.
So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Has there,
And
go ahead.
go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, I was asking, has there been any effective response to any one of these units from the CPO's office since the minister has sort of issued his ultimatum, if you call it that?
No, certainly not at the level of the joint trade union movement. We normally will have our every week Tuesday meetings, and there hasn't been any sort of reports coming from any of the unions with regards to what the minister would have said. What I can say though is that, of course, the CPO and the minister must understand that whilst the CPO is giving guidelines from the Minister of Finance to the government, the whole question of collective bargaining rests with the employer managements, where they have managements given that sole authority to treat with wage negotiations. Normally, the interministerial committee would treat with whatever proposals are submitted to the various entities. So, for instance, at TTPWU, you have a management board, you have a management level of staff, and then you have, out of that, a number of persons who are so delegated to treat with negotiations with the Postal Workers Union. And at that level, when we make proposals, whether either party makes proposal, it goes to the Ministry of Public Utilities, and then thereafter onward to the cabinet, right, for a decision. So it is in that line a number of entities would have to go through the bargaining process. But what we have seen happening lately is that the minister himself is taking it upon himself to determine when negotiations should commence and that type of thing. Remember, these periods are outstanding periods. And even if I can recall what would have happened at the port with the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Trade Union, where they would have indicated they would have settled for a particular bargaining period. And the minister, through the CPO, is now saying that it was an illegal move by the then board. I find it to be very strange that directives was given for commencement of negotiations at that particular entity, and then now the government is saying it was an illegal. That is before Seamen and Waterfront Workers Union, and I'm sure they will treat it accordingly.
Yeah.
So we are not happy. The trade union movement is not happy that workers have to make so many outstanding periods, what we call protracted periods of negotiations, and now having to wait to understand from the CPO what is the clear direction going forward. We have, in fact, just before the budget, asked the minister to seriously look at that. In the budget, we saw a one-line statement. We would call it a one-line statement that he has given that instructions. And of course, we are going to be doing follow-up meetings to determine exactly what is the government's position on wage negotiations on a whole.
Yeah. So there are several periods, contract periods, which have lapsed and which are outstanding, requiring addressing whenever these discussions shall have begun and when they will be ended with some kind of agreement or some series of agreements, because we're talking different unions for workers in different sectors in the state sector, right?
That is indeed correct. That is indeed correct.
Yeah. You say that, so in relation to with respect to what happened on the port, so the agreement that the Port Authority management reached with the SWWTU, the state's position is that was irregular and that was wrong, and so therefore that agreement is in abeyance, or the government has just put it aside and not going to consider it, and what negotiations have to take place afresh, as far as you know?
Well, we would have only gotten that information as per what I would have indicated earlier, and what you are indeed stating. So, in terms of the way forward, that is still to be addressed between the parties.
Yeah. It seems as though there's something, or this is just my feeling, that something is building in the trade union movement with respect to the government as employer. You all are coming out with something. Is that correct to speculate?
Well, I mean, from a general point of view, it's always good to engage in discussions. And that is what we would have attempted to do with the minister a couple of days before the budget, to make him understand that these outstanding periods is indeed important to workers. It impacts on their pension, it impacts on their livelihoods. And of course, we are even seeing currently where a number of workers in different sectors have been asked to work what we will call double responsibilities, and they are not being remunerated for it. We also have outstanding allowances since right in the postal workers area since 2007. No increases in allowances, and you remember the government has raised gasoline on 2 or 3 occasions, and once gas increases, other goods and services increases also. So how it impacts from a social impact on workers, their ability to spend or consume in groceries, etc., is certainly impacting on their pockets. So we as a country have to understand that in the development of any society, the inclusion of workers must be paramount. And in that regard, we have been religiously calling on the government, as indicated, as per your question, where you would have indicated something is boiling. The boil that we have is that we are hopeful that the government recognize workers. A lot of them have been working through the pandemic as the essential workers, whether it be the police officer, the prison officer, the postal worker, the nurses, even the doctors. They have their issues with salary increases, etc. So it is not to say we are not understanding the economic situation, but there has not been any level of discussion from the government or no instructions from the government since 2014. And as I would have said earlier on, there are some unions who have had negotiations outstanding since 2007.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Postal Workers Union for a bit as a separate.
Sure.
So the TT Post is a state agency. It's not what it used to be. The post office is not what it used to be. So that's a state corporation. One imagines that a great number of people employed with TT Post are working on contract. How does that affect how you go forward with negotiations?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah, well, a number of workers, yes, but not the majority is permanent workers.
Okay.
Who would have come across from the public sector via the transformation in 1999.
Yeah.
So the post office was transformed with New Zealand Post, New Zealand Post management coming to on a contract basis for 5 years. I think they would have left somewhere in 2005, 2006. So the government would have given the responsibility as per the Postal Corporation Act to have a management autonomy. How it has impacted on negotiations, we have always maintained that if it is you have organized your organizational structure to have job positions where you have managers and supervisors, then the whole question of job evaluation has to be understood. There was a job evaluation done in 2010, and there has not been any implementation to that question of negotiations for the workers at TT Post. So even on a wider scope, generally, that is another component of negotiations that is outstanding with a number of agencies and sectors. That question of job evaluation and looking at the value of a job over a 3-year period is another thing that has been stagnated.
Let's stay with that point, because it takes us back to some years in the 1980s when the late great Dr. Kenrick Rennie, for instance, was president of the PSA, and that was a big issue: job evaluation, a job evaluation exercise in public service. And the job evaluation was done, and it was just allowed to sit there for a long period of time. That is the same thing you're referring to, so that you've done a job evaluation in the Postal Service, but that no action has been taken on it, consequent upon what it requires and what it should yield?
Yes, that is indeed correct. And a lot of money would have been expended by the government to ensure that was done. But I know a number of sectors, I think in T and Tech, they would have taken the management to court and would have been successful in that regard. That is one of the areas I know would have been successful. To what level, I'm not certain, but I'm aware that there was some level of settlement with regards to the job evaluation at T and Tech. But at TTPWU, there hasn't been any real move, as we would say. We have been having meetings after meetings, and minutes after minutes just keep piling up with regards to that. And of course, the workers have indicated to the union that it is time that we go the legal way of treating with this matter.
That means we're taking the employer to court?
Yes, most likely we will have to do that.
You say most likely, so you're walking towards that step.
Yes. Well, the door is always open. At the industrial court, they always say that bilateral settlements is always a better way of treating with workers who have to wait long when matters go to court. So we, since 2010, and we have been trying, and then we came and was hit with the pandemic, and we don't know where that will take us in terms of what the government's mind is, where their minds is in really treating with all these outstanding issues.
So the last time you all got a raise was in 2010?
No. So we would have had an increase in salaries in 2013. Okay. That was the last time.
Okay.
2013. But the whole question of job evaluation was separate and apart to the traditional increases in salary.
Yeah. So that to explain this to people who may have a difficulty, such as I, in a certain way, so that the job evaluation exercise has been done, but it hasn't been dusted, so to speak. So that is there to be addressed, quite separate and apart from, well, to what extent it is separate and apart is you can explain, because that has to be taken into account if you're going to go into a new period of negotiations, so that the job evaluation exercise has to be sort of accepted and implemented as a basis for a new set of negotiations, correct?
So there was a figure presented by the evaluators when the evaluation was done. We would have realized a percentage increase that should have been applied at that time. But we couldn't have wait on the government to give the go-ahead to apply the increases. But what we would have done simultaneously to that is presented subsequent documents for the following periods in terms of what we would have been a real-time scenario with regards to the current scenario, meaning that whatever the worker would have had to enjoy at 2010, so to speak. Let me say it would have been a 30% increase, right? We would have added to that and made a statement in the proposals that the government has outstanding this 30%. However, we would like applied the following for remuneration for the periods outstanding. So with that, Mr. Johnson, and for your wider public view, is that the evaluators would have been very much comprehensive. We were part of the evaluation process, the union that is, and we understood what would have had to happen at that time. So as I said, transformation post 1999, the creation of new positions within the the postal sector. And with that, you would have had to evaluate the new jobs, the responsibilities of those jobs. But what the government did was just applied the normal, basic, traditional um,
Increases and so on.
proposals. But yes, that's what they would have done.
So it's a lot of work still to be done.
Well, we wouldn't say it's a lot of work because we would have reached almost 99% of what's supposed to happen. Right? There was only one area of concern, which was some of the title positions, job title positions, would have had what you would call on par um, application of increases, but the positions itself, based on the evaluation, would have had to be adjusted to say, let's say a position carries a higher duty and responsibility, because what they use is a particular method called the Hay method.
Yeah.
That method gives you the know-how, the knowledge, and what should be applied to the particular position as per responsibility. So we had what you would call some positions not clearly establishing a disparity. And in that regard, we would have met with the evaluators and looked at where those areas had to be adjusted, and that is indeed what we did. So we don't know the reason why, since that time, why the government has not given the necessary instruction, because that document, I'm sure, would have been rested with the chief personnel officer. I'm sure of that.
All right, Mr. Cooper, we have to leave it there, but Mr. Forbes, I'm sorry, we have to leave it there, but I just wanted to go out on the question as to, so you all are still waiting to hear from the CPO, somebody in that office, further on the minister's sort of instructions. That's what he said. I'm instructing the CPO to meet with these unions and begin negotiations. So you'll still wait to hear from somebody in the CPO's office.
Yes, and we too would also, as I said earlier on, that we would also want to meet with the minister before, or to get a better view from him, as to what the government's position is.
Okay, before you sit down with the CPO and his team, or her team.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much, sir. David Forbes.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
Okay.